So I'm here today to do a demo on turning spalted wood. I've come here before and I've talked about spalted wood, so you should all be very familiar with what spalted wood is. But today I want to talk specifically about some of the unique challenges that come with turning spalted wood. How many of you have turned spalted wood before? Yeah, so a few of you. It's got some problems and some benefits to it. So spalted wood is caused by fungi. Fungi grow into the wood and they digest the wood, they soften the wood, and they leave pigments behind. They leave zone lines, they leave greens and blues and yellows. Spalting, of course, isn't just these black lines. Blue stain is a type of spalting. If you've walked in the woods and you've seen that blue-green wood that's on the forest floor, that's often on really decayed wood, that's from elf's cup, that's a type of spalting. If you want to see pictures of it, like everything here on the cover of the book, these are all different types of spalting, you know, from this color to these pinks and blues to browns and oranges and blacks. They're all done by fungi, but they're all a byproduct of decay, which means that there are inherent density differences everywhere in this piece of wood. Where the zone lines are, tends to be a little bit denser because the zone lines are melanin and the fungus has packed in a bunch of material there. Around the zone lines tends to be decayed because that's where the fungus has eaten the wood. You can see that decay here, even just through machining. This is real punky through here, even though it's been waxed. Which means no matter how well you turn, and no matter how great your tool technique, you always have a little bit of jump. And so turning spalted wood takes patience, and it takes an ability to go slow. You have to take your time. You can't just blow through the piece. You cannot turn the speed up on the lathe and do a production level turning where you just rip out a bowl in 5 minutes. You won't cut your fibers right. The piece has very high possibility of just exploding on the lathe, which happens a lot with spalted wood if you don't know what you're doing. And you don't get a good finish, and you have to spend a lot of time sanding. But if you hold the tool angle right and you have patience, you shouldn't have to do a lot of sanding with spalted wood, even super decayed wood. There's a way to hold the tool angle. There are certain tools that can really help you get a really nice finish on spalted wood if you want to take the time. If you don't want to take the time, sanding can be your friend. But anyone here ever tried to sand spalted wood on the lathe? Yeah, how's that go for you?
Terrible.
Terrible!
You don't want to sand spalted wood.
So when you're sanding, the softer areas are going to sand out first, and so you end up with beveled and dimpled wood. And so the soft areas will sand out, leaving you the hard and normal areas, and you don't have a good surface at all. So spalted wood, it's in your best interest to get the best cutting surface you can from the tool, because any sanding that you're going to do is going to have to be off lathe on something like a drill press with some of those foam pads, which can be really nice for sanding. So before we start turning, let's talk a little bit about tools. I brought a few for show. We're only actually probably going to use one. Gouges. And I've ground them down. So when you get them from Sorby's one of the only places I can find that still makes the flat top bowl gouge. Most places use a fingernail profile, which I do not find particularly beneficial for spalted wood. It has some really good uses. I prefer the flat top bowl gouge, and a lot of that's personal preference. There's no one right or wrong tool to use. These are just what I like. And I've taken their tip down even more. They're not bottom scraper level just yet, but there's something in between the really, really flat top that you would use for cutting the bottom of a box, and in between a standard bowl gouge, which would have a little bit more of a fingernail point right here. This angle I've developed sort of over time as the best for me for working with spalted wood. It gives me a nice bevel to ride in order to make a nice smooth surface, but is also aggressive enough to do the chip out when I don't want to circle out my blanks. Some other tools that I do use on occasion, of course, a skew chisel is always your friend, despite your inherent fears that you may have of it. You can do everything you need to do with any piece of wood with a skew chisel if you know what you're doing, and you have one that doesn't have a really little tang that'll just snap on you. And so we could do everything with a skew chisel, but a lot of people have some bad baggage with skew chisels. This is going to be the bottom of the bowl, and then this is going to be the top. I've put it on a faceplate because it's so spalted. A lot of professional turners work with exotics, or they work with sound wood, and so they'll just mount between centers to do the foot and then use a chuck. Do we have a chuck? Just for show, at least?
Right there.
Okay, great. The bull chuck, of course, that will grab the foot and hold it. With spalted wood, safer is always better. So I like faceplate mounting because there are 4 really nice screws in here that are, if this thing has something wrong on the inside, which happens a lot with spalted wood. You don't know what you're getting. It's always a treasure hunt, right? It could blow up in your face if you do it wrong, or you could end up with a $3,000 bowl. It just depends on your patience level. But sometimes there's weird void spaces or something like that, and a lot of the time you'll find that these 4 or 6 screws here, after you get done carving that foot, are the only thing holding your piece together. And you've saved your piece by having this faceplate on there. You've saved potentially your student who's sitting directly across in the line of fire, and you've saved your work. I don't do stabilization with spalted wood, so I tend to use it almost completely in the raw state, unless I've got a lot invested in it and then it looks like it's going to blow apart when it's almost done. Then sometimes I'll put some cyanoacrylates in it, some of the super thin from Starbond. And in my turning classes where they work with spalted wood, we don't do any type of pressure treating stabilization, which is more for safety than for anything else, because I just don't want plastic in the air for the students. So just know that even the punkiest wood you can turn without a stabilizer. You don't have to. There's nothing wrong with stabilizers. They can put pretty colors in wood. They can give you a really nice, uniform, even surface. You can be just, there's no issue with them. I just don't personally care for them. All right. So this is a really little bowl blank, so I'm just going to go straight to my 3/8 bowl gouge. This thing says it's at 1135 RPM, and I'm sure for all the wood turners in the room you understand that these RPMs mean literally nothing. So if you shot it with a speed gun, it would come off completely different than what's on the lathe. So it's just kind of like a rough idea of speed and not an actual speed. Before we start going, I want to address issues about safety. You'll notice that I have on prescription safety glasses. And because people always ask about spalted wood, there's nothing inherently dangerous about spalted wood aside from the fact that it might blow up on you. The fungi that spalt wood that actually are responsible for the spalting are completely benign things. A lot of them are edibles. They're in the air all the time, especially out here in the forest. It's autumn. And it's raining, and the fungi right now are sporulating like you would not believe. There are spores everywhere out here in the forest, as you can tell by my sneezing, because I'm allergic to most of them. So you are getting way more exposure to fungi the second you step outside this room than you are going to get from this little piece of wood that I'm going to turn right now. With that said, of course, I say this in every presentation, wood dust is a major human carcinogen. There's tons of reports on it everywhere. You should, unless you're doing a demo where you have to talk constantly, you should be wearing some type of respiratory protection that has a NEOSH 95 or better filter in it that can be replaced. So you need to make sure that whatever mask you're wearing actually has replaceable filters that are up to spec, because the particles that we're concerned about are the really tiny ones, not the ones that you can see. It's all the stuff that's lighter than the air, that hangs out in the air and that gets in your lungs and sticks there. That's what you need the good filters for, not anything that you can see. So even if you have a dust collection system, anything that you probably have in your home shop, the filter for the blowout is not going to go down to the right micron size to protect your lungs, so you still need to be wearing the mask, even if you have dust collection. Unless you okay. The edges have not been knocked off of this, so we'll have to do just a little bit of roughing. I don't know if you guys can see this, I have a triple bevel right now on my bowl gouge, which is something that I do because I like to change angles subtly when I'm doing cutting. It doesn't matter for roughing at all. Bowl gouges and most turning tools are designed to start off on your hip. That's why their handles are so long. They help give you extra stability. So number one thing that I see with any student from teaching at Mark Adams, so I teach at Mark Adams School of Woodworking in Indiana, or from teaching just normal students at college, is the desire to spear it like it's some kind of animal. Which is problematic because if you go in and this thing gets caught, it's going to flip the tool up and it's going to kill Savannah. And that's not what we want to do today.
Minor casualties.
She's insured.
Are you?
She's a student, probably not.
So you want to make sure when you're coming in that you have your tool nice and low on your hip. Sometimes I have found, no one throw things at me for saying this, but I have found over the years that female presenting people tend to be a little bit better with beginning turning, mostly because there's a little bit more caution and there's substantially more here to weight the tool against so that you can have it down and it doesn't ride up quite as much. So I've got the tool slightly angled, talking while chipping out. I'm taking off real fast. We're not in any hurry. We're not trying to go anywhere. There's had my tool pretty open, and now as I'm doing finer cuts, I'm turning it more. Mostly because I'm trying to ride the bevel. So this is round now, but one thing I want to point out is, see how it's still, can you hear that? It's still jumping even though it's completely round. That's because we have wrought and mostly sound wood. And then this is fairly dense wood, and then it goes into wrought again. So that chatter's never going to go away. And that's one of the great things about spalted wood, is that it's constantly changing on you. And we could take 3 more passes, and part of that rot could go away, and it might be still for another few passes, and then it might go all to hell again, which is the joy of spalted wood. Now, the bevel. One of the reasons that I love bull gouges so much is because of this bevel here. And as you go from a cut that's just roughing to one that rides the bevel more, you're going to get a finer and finer cut. And you can already see, I don't know how much you were paying attention earlier, but this was pretty chipped out when we started, and that grain is already starting to lay back down, and that's because I've changed the angle of my tool. So the farther back I come, you notice that this is coming up, it's still against my body, nice and safe. The farther back I come, and the farther back I come, the less I'm cutting and the more bevel I'm riding, the finer the shavings will be, and the finer the cut, so that even if we had the time, which we only have like an hour, but if we wanted to take the time, we could continually make passes like that, and eventually this would be as smooth as this, even with all that punk. But that's time. Hear that? That's the rot right there. See how much it's kicking my tool? And then it's more stable here. If we wanted to do a full finishing cut, I'll just do one for you. It'll take several to really lay the grain flat, so don't expect huge miracles with the first one. But for a finishing cut, we want to take off as little. See how that's just powder coming off there? Mm-hmm. You want to take off as slow as you can, a continuous cut. When you're making a foot for spalted wood, when you're doing an exotic, you can get away with a foot this small because your chuck will grip it. But there's just not a lot here in terms of wood fiber anymore. So when I'm clamping those jaws on though, I'm going to make sure that they aren't gripping into the end grain that's really chewed out, if I can avoid it at all, and try and get the tension on the side grain so it's less likely to tear. This would be the one opportunity where if you really wanted that piece to stay together, noting this level of rot, because I can pick this out with my fingernail. A little super thin CA glue right there in the foot and letting it sit for about an hour will harden that thing right up. And it's not enough to affect you in terms of really having plasticized wood. Faceplates are great, of course, because they give you stability. Choosing your screws correctly is a really big deal. If they're too long, they have a tendency to break off in the spalted wood because of the way the wood pulls against the tool and how soft it is. A lot of the times the screws end up being the reinforcing rods. And so if they're too long, and this is a little bit too long for my comfort, but we didn't have anything shorter. If they're too long, they will actually snap off in the wood. If they're too short, they don't hold the wood. And so you have to kind of walk a balance between how long can you manage without it potentially snapping off. So I will get face plates that have really large openings and use really fat, short screws instead of long, thin screws. So you might think, hey, I'm in the clear because I have this nice little shaped bowl. But aha, as my students have learned, this is a very tenuous hold here. Now you could drive the tailstock up to hold it until you get it roughed out, but eventually that tailstock is going to have to come out because you've got to hollow this bowl. And so a lot of that is going to be to cut this without it catching and ripping out of the chuck is going to be a lot about going slow, having the right speed and having the right angle, like everything with spalted wood. If you are up too high and you're cutting above center, it's going to catch this tool every time and it's going to throw it out. If you're too low, like we are here, you're not going to hit center. And so getting this exactly where it needs to be is going to be key to keeping this in the chuck. But right now we're just going to do a flattening cut. Alright, so here we go. So when you go onto YouTube and you watch people wood turning, you see a lot of jab and a lot of like really tight pulling to get all those big sprays of wood chips that everyone likes to see, right? You got to be gentle with spalted wood. If you do that, it will explode on you. So you don't put a lot of pressure on it. You notice how I'm having to start sometimes out here in order to get that cut? This is where that handle's really coming into play. I'm barely putting any pressure on this tool. I'm letting the wood guide it, and I'm keeping roughly the same cutting area, but my tool is turning. The tool has to turn in order to keep the same cutting area as your angle changes. So if you're going to do that finishing cut, you have to be able to make a continuous cut, and you can't do that with basically any other tool than this. Of course, you can do it with scrapers, right? Scrapers are great. Round nose scrapers are great for that, but as we've discussed, they will not give you the right kind of finish on your spalted wood. This transition zone is something that most beginning to intermediate turners have a problem with. And a lot of that is just tool. A lot of it is not moving the tool when it needs to move. It's very similar to the traditional problems people have with skew chisels, in that if you're doing beads and coves with a skew chisel, the skew chisel cuts at one particular angle, and it skips at every other angle and catches. And so if you do not quickly change your angle so that it stays where it needs to be when you're doing a bead or a cove, it catches and runs. And so you have to make a decision here. There's nothing inherently wrong with the thickness of this rim. Maybe you want it a little thinner, maybe you can't make it any thicker, of course. But you have to look at how well is this wood holding together? How well is this end grain here? If I continuously take off more and more of this, is the next pass I'm going to make going to be my last, because it blows up. So this is the stage where you have to kind of go through and touch the wood, especially in these really punky areas. Start trying to dig your fingernails in. You see, I don't know if you guys can see this. You're welcome to come up. It's really soft here in the center, and the fibers are pulling out. But that's an issue here, not here. So I should be able to go at least a little thinner. This bowl is really light, by the way. Mike picks it up. So now it's just a little thick in here for my liking, so I might take it down again or I might not, depending upon how the wood's doing. What I would want to start looking at right now is it's close enough to start looking at finishing cuts. And to do those, we're already out to here. This is probably the hardest thing for new turners, is to get that bevel to ride. You got to be way out here with this bowl gouge, which means instead of here, your hand is here. You got to start it right here, and then again, it'll come back in, which is kind of nice. The worst part is right here where that catch can happen, and it comes back in, and then hitting here, because we have an abrupt angle change, what that means is your torso has to come back in order to have the bevel rub appropriately along this curve to run it all the way in through here. So you're having a huge change of direction from point A to point B. So you have to think about where your feet are, because you have to be able to lean in here and then come all the way back here without moving your feet and without stopping that cut, which can be a real challenge. But we've basically made a bowl at this point.